It was just past midnight when my phone buzzed. A single notification from my boss, Vincent. I ignored it. I knew it was him. He always texted at the oddest hours, demanding things with no real urgency, like some twisted power trip. Tonight, though, I wasn't about to entertain his late-night games. I'd been at the hospital for over 72 hours straight, keeping watch over my dad, who had just slipped into a stable condition after a series of heart surgeries. I hadn't slept, barely eaten, and I was running on fumes. I didn't even flinch when the phone vibrated again. I'd just stepped into the restroom to splash water on my face when it buzzed a third time. A notification from Vincent. "I need you on a call. Now." I shut the bathroom door behind me and sat on the edge of the sink, rubbing my temples. A loyalty test, I told myself. He knew damn well I'd be at the hospital. He knew how exhausted I was. But there he was, flexing his power in his usual way, expecting me to drop everything for his whims. I didn't answer. By morning, it didn't matter. I hadn't even had the chance to check my email before my phone buzzed again. This time, it was a formal termination letter from the company. My heart sank as I read the words. Insufficient response to a critical matter. I was accused of insubordination for missing Vincent's call. I read it 3 more times, hoping for some hidden error, but there was no mistake. The email had been sent to me hours before I even had the chance to see his messages. This was no accident. This was planned. And it wasn't because I'd missed a call. It was because he wanted me out. He always had from the start. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I put my phone down, staring at the space where my father's hospital bed should have been. And yet, the weight of this betrayal, the quiet violence of being cut off from everything I built, it was too much. They thought they could just erase me, but I'd built more than they realized. There were layers of the city grid I designed, ones no one knew about, ones only I could access. And now, they would need me more than ever. They just didn't know it yet. I hadn't even made it to the hospital coffee shop before my phone buzzed with a new email notification. I wasn't in the mood for more bad news, but I opened it anyway. The subject line alone hit me like a punch to the gut. Termination notice. I read through the email in a haze, still reeling from the shock of yesterday. Insubordination due to failure to respond to an urgent request, it said. The words blurred together for a moment. I stared at them, barely comprehending. Then it hit me. This wasn't a mistake. This was planned. There was no mention of the fact that I'd been at the hospital for days on end, no understanding that I was running on fumes, only an accusation that I hadn't answered the call that wasn't even important, the call that had been part of some sick, premeditated test of my loyalty, the call that was meant to strip me of everything I'd worked for. I sat on the cold tile floor of the hospital restroom, the sharp edge of reality sinking in. I wasn't just being fired, I was being erased. I checked the timestamp of the email. It had been sent hours before Vincent's midnight message. I clicked into the system to check if I had been locked out of my company profile. Sure enough, when I tried to access the city grid, a prompt appeared. Access denied. Biometric reauthorization failed. I wasn't surprised. What did surprise me was the realization of how meticulous this had all been. The termination was preemptive, designed to ensure that I couldn't undo their decision. They'd locked me out before I even had a chance to fight back. A carefully orchestrated trap, one that painted me as the disloyal one, when in truth, I was the one being cast aside. I closed my eyes, letting the weight of it all settle in. I'd poured my soul into that project, the grid, the design, every single layer that would revolutionize the city's transport system. It had been my dream, my vision, but in that moment, it wasn't mine anymore. I pulled up my personal backup system, hoping for a glimmer of something to hold on to. I found it immediately. A hidden failsafe I'd embedded in the system years ago. Something no one knew about, something I had built to protect myself, just in case. I smiled bitterly. They thought they had erased me, but they hadn't. They never even knew the system had a piece of me embedded in its very foundation. My fingerprint was still there, buried deep within the code. The critical layer, the one they had dismissed as theoretical, was now what was keeping the grid alive. No one would be able to restart it without me. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against the wall. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for now, I let myself feel the quiet satisfaction of knowing that they hadn't won. Not yet. The battle was just beginning. I closed my eyes and leaned back, letting the hum of the office air conditioning fill the space around me. I was back in that sterile, white-walled office, alone again. The glow of my computer screen was the only light, the only companion I had for hours on end. It wasn't the work that got to me. It was the isolation, the silence, the way my contributions were always dismissed. It had always been this way. As chief planner of the city's revolutionary transport grid, I was the invisible hand. No one seemed to care how I worked late, how I made sure every detail was perfect, while others took the credit. It was always Vincent's name that was pushed forward, even though he had never designed a single stretch of infrastructure in his life. And then, there were the meetings, the ones where I presented my designs, only to be told that my ideas were too cautious, too theoretical. Vincent's dismissals echoed in my head, louder now than they ever were when I worked under him. "We need bold ideas, Layla," he would say, the words laced with condescension. "What you're proposing is nice, but it's too safe. We can't afford to be cautious." But I knew the truth. The system I had created wasn't just a theory, it was real. And it was mine. Every layer, every line of code, was carefully crafted with the city's future in mind. The city was counting on me, even if they didn't know it yet. I remember every holiday, every birthday I'd skip to perfect the system. My fingers numb from the hours of tweaking, coding, and reworking every detail. And when my dad had his first stroke, I'd stayed up through the night, rewriting algorithms while worrying about him, always wondering if I was doing enough. There was no room for personal life, not when the city needed me. And still, no one noticed. I smiled bitterly. How could they? I was never in the press photos, never at the conferences or grant ceremonies, always sidelined. But I kept building. No one knew the secret layers I had designed, the fail-safes buried deep in the code. They wouldn't know until it was too late. I pulled up the old files, ones I'd protected for years, the ones no one knew about. The critical layer, the one that had my fingerprint embedded in its core, the layer that would recognize only me. I'd filed the intellectual property protections years ago under a shell company in my father's name. He never knew about it. I'd done it as a precaution because, deep down, I knew one day this moment might come. I had spent years making sure no one could take what I'd built, not even Vincent. The irony was, no one had ever believed in it enough to want to. But now I realized that I had ensured it would only work if I authorized it. Only I could unlock it. I leaned back in my chair and let out a breath. No one knew this layer existed. No one knew I had protected myself this way, even as they pushed me to the side, overlooked my ideas, and called my work safe. Safe. Maybe it had been, but it was also genius. I'd never wanted to be the center of attention. I didn't care for the accolades or the recognition. But as I sat there, staring at the code, I realized that no matter what they tried to do, no matter how they erased me from their narrative, they would always need me. They just didn't know it yet. It was the day of the demo, the one Vincent had been hyping up for months. A room full of city officials, contractors, and potential investors sat in anticipation, waiting for the presentation to begin. I could almost feel the weight of their expectations from where I sat in the back of the room, silently observing. Vincent stood at the front, smiling with that smug confidence he wore like a suit. He was in his element, always the center of attention, always the one taking credit. Today he was about to showcase the city's new transport grid, the one that I had built. He would show them how revolutionary it was, how cutting edge, how state-of-the-art. I wasn't supposed to be there, of course. After all, I'd been erased. Officially, I was no longer a part of the company, no longer part of the project I had spent years designing. But my fingerprints were still all over it. Every single line of code, every adjustment, every piece of infrastructure that held it together was mine. As the lights dimmed and the screens flickered to life, I stayed in my seat, trying to block out the growing panic. I could see the system interface on the screen, the city grid that I had carefully designed. But something wasn't right. There was a slight stutter in the video feed, a subtle glitch in the smooth operation of the demo. Vincent didn't notice it. He was too busy talking up the benefits of the system to the audience, his voice full of false confidence. But I could feel it. The system was struggling to run, as if it were fighting against something it didn't recognize. I knew exactly what was happening. The fail-safe layer. The one I'd built in secret. The layer that wouldn't allow the system to function without my authorization. The demo continued, but the interface kept freezing. Engineers backstage scrambled to troubleshoot, their voices growing more frantic. They tried to override the system. Nothing worked. Vincent turned to the engineers behind the stage, frustration creeping into his voice. "What's going on? Why isn't it responding?" We can't get in," one of the engineers stammered. "It's locked." Vincent's face turned a shade of red that almost matched the anger in his eyes. He gestured to the screen, which read the words, "Authorization missing. System in standby." His voice wavered as he tried to salvage the situation. "It's just a technical issue," he said, trying to force a smile. "We'll get this fixed in no time. Nothing to worry about, folks." But there was no mistaking it. The grid wouldn't function without me. The system was locked, and only my biometric signature could release it. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. Vincent stammered for a moment longer, then his voice faltered completely. No one moved. The engineers backstage were still scrambling, but they were as powerless as Vincent. I sat back in my seat, staring at the frozen screen, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. For years, they'd pushed me aside, disregarded my contributions, and treated my ideas as nothing more than theoretical concepts. Now, the system they relied on was showing them just how wrong they were, and it was a demonstration that no one, not even Vincent, could ignore. For a moment, the room stayed quiet. Then, the murmurs started. The investors exchanged confused glances. Some of the officials looked at each other, unsure of what was happening. Vincent tried to bluff again, but it was clear, without me, the system was nothing. In that moment, the grid was speaking for me. I didn't need to say a word. The demo had collapsed, and with it, Vincent's carefully crafted illusion that he had built this alone. I felt a grim satisfaction, but there was no triumph in it. The moment had come, but the war was far from over. I watched the fallout unfold from the comfort of my apartment, an odd sense of detachment pulling at my thoughts. My phone had been silent all morning, but as the hours ticked by, the notifications began. First an email, then a message, then another, until it felt like the world was vibrating with alerts. It started with the engineers who had worked under me. Messages flooded in, most of them silent acknowledgments of what was happening, some of them filled with apologies. They'd seen it. They knew the system was locked, and they knew it was because I had designed it that way. One of the messages was from Blaine, a junior engineer I'd mentored a couple of years ago. I opened it with a sinking feeling. "Blaine, I'm with XLab now. They have a stake in the company, but I've been following your work from the sidelines. Just want you to know you built something special. If you need an ally, I've got a way in. No one knows who truly owns this. Just take care of yourself. I know what it cost you." The words landed like a soft blow to the chest, but something in me flickered at the gesture. For the first time since all of this started, I felt seen. Not for my resignation or for being the scapegoat, but for the sacrifice, the work, the years spent creating something meaningful. Another message popped up, this time from a colleague in the company's research department, Greg. He was more direct. "Greg, what they did to you is bullshit. You know you're the only one who made that system what it is. It's crashing, Layla. They're all scrambling. If you ever need someone on the outside, I'm here. You deserve better than this." I sat back, running a hand through my hair, overwhelmed by the realization that, for all their attempts to erase me, people still remembered. They hadn't forgotten the late nights, the system I had built, or the way Vincent and the others had belittled every idea of mine that didn't fit their narrative. The phone buzzed again, this time a text from an unknown number. "Anonymous. I've been reading the news. The company's failing. You probably don't need to hear it, but your grid's still the backbone of everything they're pitching. Without you, nothing works. And now, the whole damn city's figuring it out. Just wanted you to know. Hang in there, Layla." I stared at the message for longer than I should have. There was something unspoken in that message, an acknowledgement of my silent influence, something that had once been invisible to everyone else, but not to those who had worked with me. And yet, as I read through the lines, a deeper feeling began to rise in me, something almost like relief. Not that the company was collapsing or that they were struggling, but that, for the first time, my impact, my years of labor were finally being recognized, even if it wasn't in the way I'd imagined. It wasn't triumph I felt, just the strange satisfaction of knowing that all my work hadn't been in vain. It hadn't been about the recognition, it had been about building something that mattered. And even though Vincent and his team had tried to erase me from the picture, my legacy was still there, in the system. In the memories of those who had worked with me, I leaned back in my chair, allowing myself a brief moment of quiet. The system was holding strong, and though my name wasn't in the headlines or plastered across investor presentations, I knew something they didn't. The city depended on me. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel invisible. I felt real, and somewhere in the back of my mind, the thought settled, I'll get my revenge, but not through chaos. Not through their systems. I'll build something new. The old contract sat on my desk, its weight far heavier than the paper it was printed on. I stared at it, the familiar lines of legal jargon now taking on a new meaning. Clause 47.3. The clause I had put in place years ago, when I knew something like this could happen. When I made sure that if I was ever terminated without cause, I would retain full control over my creation. I had always been diligent about protecting my work, but this clause felt like an insurance policy I never thought I'd need. Now, it wasn't just my safety net, it was my lifeline. The clause voided all transfer rights to the infrastructure if the originator was fired without cause. It was ironclad. I opened my email, scanning the flood of messages from investors, clients, and even journalists, all asking for explanations about the failed demo and the sudden collapse of the project. The panic in their words was palpable. They'd expected a smooth presentation, a seamless pitch, but instead the grid had frozen, and Vincent's company was left scrambling to cover up its failure. Investor 1, we've invested millions in your vision. What's going on? What happened in that demo? Investor 2, the grid has potential, but without Layla's leadership, it's nothing. We're pulling out unless we hear from her directly. Their fear was tangible, but it didn't faze me. I already knew the truth. They'd put their faith in a project, a vision, but they hadn't respected the architect behind it. Now, they were reaping what they'd sown. I pulled up the contract again, my eyes skimming over the details until they settled on the line that mattered. Clause 47.3. It wasn't just legal protection. It was my way of making sure that, in the end, I would control the grid, even if I had to do it from the outside. I reached for my phone and drafted a simple response. Subject: System ownership. Formal declaration to whom it may concern. As per the terms of my employment contract, specifically Clause 47.3, I am formally asserting control over the city. Infrastructure grid. Effective immediately, I am invoking this clause to ensure the system remains under my authority. I will not be engaging in further discussions regarding this matter until the situation has been resolved. Regards, Layla Moore. I hit send and leaned back in my chair. The moment had come. The chaos I had sensed was now fully realized, and Vincent and his board were left scrambling to maintain what they had already lost. They hadn't just lost a planner. They had lost control over the very system they had tried to claim as their own. The phone rang almost immediately after I sent the email. I didn't pick up. The system had shut down, and now the world would see what it was like when they relied on me without acknowledging me. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. The room was stark and cold, the kind of sterile space designed for uncomfortable confrontations. Vincent sat at the far end of the table, flanked by 2 board members who hadn't spared me a second glance in years. They were all silent as I entered, my footsteps deliberate as I made my way to the empty seat across from them. Vincent's eyes flickered to the stack of papers I placed on the table in front of me. His gaze hardened, recognizing the weight of the moment. "You're here for a reason," he said, voice laced with his usual condescension. "Let's get this over with, Layla." "What's this about?" I didn't respond immediately. I let the silence stretch between us, my fingers lightly tapping the edge of the table. There was no need for preamble. They knew what was coming. After all, they had orchestrated this entire mess. I slid the first document toward Vincent. It was a printed copy of Clause 47.3, the clause I had embedded in my contract years ago. I didn't look up as he began reading it, but I could feel his irritation rise. The words were clear. If the originator of the system was terminated without cause, all transfer rights were void. The system is mine, I said, my voice calm, measured. And now, it's in my control. I've invoked this clause. There was a beat of stunned silence. The board members exchanged nervous glances, but Vincent didn't flinch. His expression remained stoic, though his eyes were calculating. You think this contract gives you the right to take it all from us? Vincent asked, his voice a low growl. We built this together. It's not just yours. No, Vincent, I said, placing the second document in front of him. You built nothing. I built it, and I've always been the one keeping it together, even when you dismissed my ideas as too cautious. He opened the second document slowly, and I watched as the reality of the situation settled over him. It was the registration of my LLC, the one I'd set up under my father's name, the one I'd used to protect my intellectual property, the layer of the system that only recognized my biometric signature. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the registration. I could see his mind working, piecing together the chain of events. The sudden firing, the locked system, the preemptive termination. It was all falling apart for him. You're really going to do this? One of the board members asked, his voice shaking with a hint of disbelief. I nodded. You have two options. You can acknowledge my authorship publicly, give credit where it's due, and move forward. Or you can lose everything, permanently. The room went dead quiet. They had no leverage left. All the power Vincent had wielded over me, over the company, was gone. The system had already shut down without my authorization, and now the only way to restore it was through me. I watched as the tension in the room mounted, the weight of the decision pressing on each of them. Vincent finally leaned back in his chair, his face a mask of frustration and defeat. He was a man who prided himself on controlling every situation, but here, in front of me, he was powerless. They all were. I don't believe you'll do it, he said, his voice steady, but I could see the cracks forming. You don't have a choice, I replied. This is no longer about what you believe. It's about what's real. You'll either give me the credit I deserve, or you'll lose everything I built. The board members exchanged a look, and I knew they were beginning to see the truth, the one they'd tried to ignore all along. They had underestimated me, and now they had no way out. Vincent, defeated and broken, finally nodded. Fine, he muttered. We'll acknowledge your authorship, but don't think this is over. I smiled, but it wasn't a smile of triumph. It was a smile of closure. It's over for you, Vincent, I said softly, and now I move forward. I stood up, leaving the room in stunned silence behind me. I had taken control of my own future, and now nothing would stand in my way. The morning light filtered through the blinds, casting long shadows across my desk. I sat there, the papers before me, final signatures, the weight of the future on the edge of my pen. I had made my decision. It was time to move on. A message popped up on my phone, a simple notification. You've done enough proving. Now we protect that. The words came from the CEO of the new lab I was joining, Veritone, the company that valued integrity over quick gains, that believed in developer credit and sustainable infrastructure instead of cutting corners. It wasn't just a job. It was an opportunity to reshape the future of urban design in a way that matched my ideals. I looked at the paper again, the final release for the new system. It was no longer just a project for a corporate giant or a broken company. It was my legacy, reborn under a new name. Veritone was a clean slate, but my fingerprints would remain at its core. The grid I had built, the system that had been pushed to the sidelines, was now being reborn. And this time, it would carry my name, my vision, and my values. I signed the papers. When I walked into the development room at Veritone for the first time, my name was etched in metal outside the door. Chief Architect, Leila Morin. A moment of validation, yes, but also something more profound. It was a recognition not just of what I had created, but of who I was. The work I had done in secret, the sacrifices, the years of pushing myself further than I ever thought possible. It was finally going to be recognized the way it always should have been. The CEO greeted me with a quiet smile. Welcome, he said, his tone sincere, not as a formality, but as a genuine gesture. We've been waiting for you. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt at peace. I had found a place where the work mattered, where my contributions would not be erased, but celebrated. I wasn't just another cog in the machine anymore. I was the machine. The future was finally mine to shape. And this time, it was on my terms. The following days were a quiet storm. My old company, once a juggernaut of innovation, was unraveling piece by piece. The panic was palpable. Defense contracts stalled. Investors pulled out. News outlets picked up on the drama, dissecting every angle of Vincent's failed demo and my sudden disappearance from the spotlight. A press release landed in my inbox late one evening. I opened it out of curiosity, my finger hesitating on the screen. It was from a key investor, one who had stood by the company for years. The release was short and to the point. Our investment was in a vision. The vision isn't there anymore. We can no longer support a company that disregards its foundational leadership. Layla Morin was the architect of the city grid, and her absence is the heart of the system's failure. I read it twice before closing the email, a quiet satisfaction creeping over me. I didn't need to hold a press conference or take a stage. The truth was finally coming out. My work, my sacrifice, it had been acknowledged. Then an email pinged through my inbox. It was from Blaine. His name brought a strange sense of calm, the connection to the past now transforming into something more genuine. Blaine, we're ready to talk resolution. Let's discuss what comes next. You're still the only one who can fix this. I stared at the email for a moment, the words weighing on me. But it was no longer my fight, not anymore. The system was mine, and with that came the freedom to walk away. I deleted his email without a second thought. I didn't need to fix their mess. They had the tools, the resources, but not the vision. They had used me up, erased me, and now they could deal with the consequences of their greed and short-sightedness. As I stood at my mother's kitchen counter, slicing apples for a quiet snack, I watched the market implode on the news, the live tickers updating with every failed deal and investor pullout. The chaos, the confusion, it was all because of the same thing I had tried to warn them about. They had never truly understood the system. They had never understood me. The old system I built was still displaying the message: authorization missing, owner not verified. I watched it on the small screen and felt a surge of quiet finality. My fingerprints were all over it, but I didn't need it anymore. They could fight for control, but it was already too late. I had built something greater than them. With every moment, the company I had poured my soul into continued to crumble. And in that destruction, I found my peace. It wasn't a triumph. It was a quiet, steady recognition that I was no longer invisible. The world was seeing me for what I was, the heart of the system they could never truly replace. The young engineer stood in front of me, his eyes wide with disbelief, his mouth slightly open. I don't understand this system. How did you make it so responsive, so aware? It's not just code, it's something else. I smiled, not with arrogance, but with a deep, almost wistful pride. It wasn't just code, I said, my voice steady but rich with meaning. It was memory. He looked at me, still processing, unsure of what I meant. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the moment settling on me. I built it to remember, I continued. To remember the years I spent invisible, ignored, and erased. But it also remembers what's important. It recognizes who it's meant for. I paused, letting the silence hang for a moment. When you build something that has the potential to change everything, you don't just leave it to chance. You make sure it has a piece of you in it, a memory. That's what gives it life. That's what makes it more than just a tool. He nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to the monitor where the re-engineered system now ran smoothly, free from the constraints of its past. Veritone, the new name, the new future. I had left behind the broken company, the battles, the erasure. Now it was all mine. It was something new, something that valued integrity and long-term vision over immediate profits and politics. As I walked the halls of the new lab, the walls adorned with sleek designs and green sustainable energy solutions, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace, and with it, a sense of belonging. Here, I wasn't invisible. Here, I was the architect. The CEO walked past me, his expression calm, but knowing. He said nothing at first, then simply, You've done enough proving. Now we protect that. I nodded. There was no need for words. In the end, it wasn't about proving myself to anyone. It was about creating something that would stand the test of time, something built from sacrifice, from brilliance, and from the memory of everything I had endured. Later that day, as I signed the final documents, sealing my legacy, the weight of it all felt different. Veritone wasn't just a company. It was the culmination of years of hidden work, years of quiet perseverance, and now it would carry my name in the way I had always wanted it to. Etched in metal outside the dev room, Chief Architect Layla Morin. I smiled softly, stepping away from the desk. The future was waiting, and for the first time, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. The system I had built was no longer the invisible force behind the scenes. It was the blueprint for the future, and so was I. The world was finally starting to see it. And this time, I wasn't erasing myself. I was standing clear, steady, and known.